She walked into the grand estate dressed in a simple linen dress and worn cardigan, no diamonds. No designer heels. Just quiet grace. The others? Tailored suits, champagne in hand, and cruel smirks behind polite smiles. They whispered that she was the maid, or maybe an ex-lover hoping for scraps. But what no one knew was that nobody wasn't there to beg, she was there to inherit everything. What unfolded that day wasn't just a will reading, it was a test of character. A mirror held up to the greedy and the proud. And when the truth was finally revealed, their masks shattered, their fortunes vanished, and justice walked in, wearing flats. This is the story of Grace Bennett, and how a room full of polished heirs was brought to their knees by a woman they never bothered to see. Stay with us, because the ending? You won't believe who walks through that door. Part 1. The woman they thought didn't belong. The moment Grace Bennett stepped into the hall of the Blake estate, time seemed to pause, just long enough for the whispers to begin. She wore a soft gray linen dress, slightly wrinkled at the hem. A faded blue cardigan hung loosely from her shoulders. Her flats made no sound on the marble floor. She wasn't wearing a single piece of jewelry. No designer handbag, no makeup, not even a watch, just a small cloth purse, stitched by hand, slung gently over her shoulder. And that was all it took. A man in a gold tie, Nathan Blake, Jonathan Blake's second cousin, chuckled and leaned to the woman beside him. Did housekeeping get lost? The woman, Charlotte, Nathan's sister, laughed behind her hand. Maybe she's the caterer's assistant, or one of those mistresses hoping for a miracle. The room echoed with smirks. Eyes darted toward Grace, full of judgment, smartphones tilted just slightly, clicks and flashes hidden behind sips of champagne. Grace stood silently near the back, her posture calm, her hands resting on the strap of her bag. She didn't speak, she didn't flinch, she just observed. She saw the crystal chandeliers glittering above, the $1,000 suits, the silk gowns, the way people held their glasses like trophies, each sip laced with rehearsed condolences and private greed. They were here for Jonathan Blake's will, a billionaire's legacy. And in their minds, Grace was an intruder, a shadow, a nobody, who had walked into a room meant for bloodlines and bank accounts. They didn't know the truth. Not yet. A younger woman, Lexi, niece of a former board member, tilted her phone toward a friend. Taking bets, she whispered. Thrift store queen over there? I say she doesn't last 10 minutes. Her friend laughed. Unless she brought snacks. Another voice joined in. If she starts vacuuming, I'm leaving. Still, Grace didn't react, even when someone slipped a napkin into the back of her bag with the words, "Charity case," written in sharp black ink. She didn't move. She stood near a tall window, the misty hills behind her like a painting. Her presence quiet, unshakable. To them, her silence was weakness, but they couldn't see the steel beneath it. What they didn't know, what they never even imagined, was that Grace Bennett was not only Jonathan Blake's wife, but the woman he trusted most. And today's will reading? It wasn't just about inheritance. It was about revealing who in that room still had a soul worth keeping. Part 2. The Quiet Storm. The laughter didn't stop. It only grew louder. Someone took a photo of the napkin stuck in Grace's bag, the one labeled, "Charity case," and passed it around like a joke at a backyard barbecue. A whisper here, a giggle there. The cruelty came in waves, masked by polished smiles and clinking glasses. Grace Bennett stood still. Her eyes scanned the room, not in fear, but in quiet awareness. Every glance, every smirk, every insult, she registered them all. Not one face would be forgotten. At the far side of the hall, Gerald Whitman, a former investor with slicked-back silver hair, leaned toward his wife. "She's embarrassing herself," he said with a sneer, standing there like she belongs. His wife, cloaked in a shawl that cost more than Grace's entire outfit, nodded. "The dress, the shoes, it's like she's mocking us." No one offered her a seat. No one asked her name. They didn't see a woman in mourning. They saw a mistake, a stain on their curated image of what a will reading should look like. And yet, Grace did not leave. She stood by the tall window, where the fog still curled across the hills like soft breath. She held her bag close, not out of fear, but out of habit. That bag had traveled with her to hospital visits, Small towns. Late-night coffee runs with Jonathan. It was stitched by her mother before she passed. There was meaning in its plainness. But to this room, it was just another reason to laugh. Across the room, Trevor, Jonathan's third cousin and a mid-level tech CEO, snorted. I bet she's here to plead for a scholarship fund or something. What's she waiting for? Free hors d'oeuvres. Charlotte, Nathan's sister, added in a falsely sympathetic tone. Maybe she doesn't know this isn't a food drive. Poor thing. Lexi, the influencer niece, couldn't resist the moment. She raised her phone again, capturing a short video clip of Grace standing still, looking quietly toward the front. This is going on my story, she whispered. Caption. She thought dressing like a librarian gets you the Blake estate. They all laughed. Grace's eyes flicked to the girl's phone. She knew the type who mistook cruelty for cleverness. Still, she said nothing. She remembered Jonathan's words months ago, whispered into her hair one quiet evening. The money means nothing, Grace, but the people around me. They'll show you who they are when they think I'm not watching. He had known. He had seen it coming. And Grace? She agreed to stay hidden, to let them reveal their true colors. She just hadn't expected it to hurt quite this much. Each joke, each whisper, was like a cold hand on her skin. Not because they wounded her pride, but because they confirmed everything Jonathan feared. She had hoped, somewhere deep down, that one of them might show kindness. Offer her water, ask if she was okay, speak to her like a person. But no one did. Even the ones who stayed silent weren't innocent. Their silence was permission, complicity. As the grandfather clock in the corner struck 10, the doors creaked open. Arthur Grayson, Jonathan's longtime attorney, stepped into the room with a dark leather briefcase in hand. His presence silenced the crowd instantly. Grayson was a man who wore his age with authority. Gray hair, steady hands, and a voice that had read the last wishes of dozens of powerful men. He glanced around the room, briefly pausing on Grace. His brow twitched just slightly. A flicker of acknowledgement. Then he walked forward and laid the briefcase on the central table. He clicked it open, pulled out one single envelope, sealed in red wax. The room leaned in. Phones were silenced, breaths held, but not before Gerald raised a trembling hand and pointed right at Grace. This woman is a fraud, he boomed. Jonathan would never allow someone like her in this room. A few murmurs of agreement rose. She doesn't belong here, his wife added. This is a private matter. Grace looked straight ahead, unshaken. They still didn't know. Grayson didn't flinch. He placed the sealed envelope on the table, folded his hands, and said, "We are here to honor the final wishes of Jonathan Everett Blake. Please be seated." Part 3. The name in the will. As the crowd settled, an uneasy hush fell over the Blake estate's grand hall. The air was thick with anticipation and quiet greed, as if every breath drawn came with a silent prayer. Let it be me. Grace Bennett remained standing near the back window, untouched by the scramble for seats. She wasn't here to fight for space. She was here to watch. Arthur Grayson, the attorney, adjusted his glasses, broke the wax seal on the envelope, and unfolded the letter with a kind of reverence. The rustle of paper echoed in the still room. I, Jonathan Everett Blake, Grayson began, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament. There was a collective inhale, as though the whole room held its breath together. To my family, colleagues, and long-standing associates, Grayson continued, I leave nothing but this truth. Wealth reveals character, not worth. The words dropped like bricks. A silence so absolute followed that even the chandeliers seemed to stop shimmering. Nathan Blake's smirk evaporated. Charlotte's wine glass trembled slightly in her hand. Lexi's phone lowered an inch. What does that mean? Gerald Whitman asked, voice brittle. Grayson's voice remained even. All assets, properties, accounts, intellectual holdings, and corporate shares are bequeathed to one person. The only one who stood by me without knowing what she stood to gain. The only one who never asked for anything but my company. My wife, Grace Bennett. A gasp, sharp, raw, rippled through the crowd like electricity. Heads turned, necks craned. What? Charlotte hissed, almost choking on her drink. Wife? Jonathan wasn't married, Nathan barked. Lexi dropped her phone, the sound of the case hitting the marble floor like punctuation. Gerald stood, finger raised like a judge. This is absurd. A scam. A setup. Who even is she? Grayson reached into the briefcase again, unfazed by the storm erupting before him. I anticipated this reaction, he said dryly. He pulled out a folder, flipping it open. Marriage license. Signed 7 years ago. 2 witnesses. Sarah Ellis. Nurse. Michael Reed. Librarian. He laid out several photographs. Jonathan and Grace. Arms around each other outside a courthouse. Jonathan and Grace at a cabin near Lake Champlain. Jonathan and Grace at a 4th of July cookout. Paper plates in hand. Laughter in their eyes. They were married, Grayson said simply. It was private, because that's how he wanted it. Lexi's voice cracked through the air. That can't be real. Anyone can Photoshop a picture. Grayson raised an eyebrow, then produced a USB drive. Video footage from their wedding. Verified, time-stamped, original file, not edited. He plugged it into a nearby monitor. The screen flickered to life. There, on the screen, Jonathan Blake stood in a navy suit. Grace, in a simple white dress. Hair pulled back. A small courthouse behind them. They were laughing, fumbling through vows, kissing. A woman clapped behind the camera. That's my girl, she said, her voice warm and real. The crowd watched in stunned silence. The kind that drowns protest. Charlotte's crimson lipstick looked too bright now. Gerald's expensive cufflinks clinked as his arms fell to his sides. Grace, still standing in the back, did not gloat. She did not smirk. She simply stepped forward, her footsteps light but echoing like thunder. She stood beside Grayson, her presence suddenly undeniable. I didn't come here for the money, Grace said, her voice low and clear. I came to see who would remember Jonathan as a person, not a dollar sign. She looked at Lexi, who swallowed hard. She looked at Gerald, who now couldn't meet her eyes. I came to see if any of you would look at a quiet woman in a plain dress and still treat her with dignity. No one responded. Now we know. Grayson closed the file. The only sound was the slow, deliberate tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then Grace added softly, Jonathan gave me more than his name. He gave me his trust. I honored that. The question is, did you? And from the looks on their faces, the answer was already written. Part 4. The man they buried too soon. Just as the room began to absorb the weight of Grace's words, a soft chime echoed from a speaker near the head of the room. It was subtle, but enough to pull every gaze toward the screen still glowing on the wall. The wedding footage had ended. Now, a new feed flickered to life. At first, there was only static. Then, an office, dimly lit, a man sitting in a leather chair. He looked older, leaner, but unmistakable. Jonathan Blake, alive. Breaths caught in throats. Several people rose halfway from their seats, as if unsure whether they were witnessing a ghost or a resurrection. Grace stood still, not shocked, just quietly steady. Hello, Jonathan said. His voice was calm, familiar, firm. If you're seeing this, you failed. The room froze. I needed to know, he continued. Who among you would remember that I was a man, not just an inheritance? Who would respect my absence, honor my memory, and welcome a stranger without calculation or cruelty? He leaned forward, his face, once only known through corporate magazine covers and boardroom projections, now felt achingly human. Grace warned me this would happen, that people I trusted would reveal themselves the moment they thought I was no longer watching. He glanced toward the camera. His eyes seemed to pierce through the lens, through the screen, through each person in the room. She was right. Gasps erupted. Nathan's tie looked suddenly too tight. Charlotte's drink trembled in her grip. And just then, as if the screen had merely been the opening act, the double doors at the end of the grand hall creaked open. All heads turned. There he was, in the flesh. Jonathan Blake. No suit, no press, no stage lighting. Just a man in a plain blazer, slacks, and worn leather shoes that still had dirt on the soles. The gasp turned to silence. No one moved, not even the lawyer. Jonathan walked slowly, deliberately, as if reclaiming every inch of that room with each step. He reached Grace and stopped beside her. Their eyes met only briefly, but it was enough to tell the room everything they needed to know. They were in this together. He turned to the crowd. This was never about death. He said, this was about truth. A few dared to speak. This is outrageous. Gerald barked. You faked your own death? No. Jonathan replied evenly. I staged a disappearance. My jet went missing. It wasn't found. The media made assumptions, and you all played along. You lied to us. Lexi snapped. This is cruel. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. You called my wife a joke. A maid. A scam artist. You made her a meme before you asked her name. You passed judgment not because of what she said or did, but because of what she wore. Lexi's words shriveled in her mouth. Jonathan raised his voice slightly. Firm now. This reading wasn't to divide assets. It was to divide people. He turned to Arthur Grayson, who calmly opened another folder and handed it to Jonathan. In this file, Jonathan said, is a record of every insult, every social post, every sneer, everything you said and did while thinking you were safe. Anonymous. Untouchable. Eyes darted. Panic flickered in polished expressions. Anyone named in this document, he continued, is officially removed from my will. Not because you lost my love, but because you lost my respect. A stunned silence settled like a fog. Those who treated Grace with dignity, Jonathan said, even in her silence, will be honored, and those who didn't, have already received more of my time than they deserve. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a remote. With one click, another screen on the wall lit up, security footage, time stamped from earlier that morning. There they were, the smirks, the comments, the napkin shoved into her bag, Lexi filming her, Gerald's accusations, Nathan's snide remarks, laughter captured from every angle. A mirror, finally held up to their own faces. No one could deny it now. The truth was playing on loop for all to see. And Grace? Grace stood beside her husband, not with pride, but with peace. She didn't need their approval. She had something they couldn't fake. Character. Part 5. What truly remains. The screen faded to black. The last frame, a freeze of Lexi's smirk as she filmed Grace, lingered just long enough to sting. The room was silent, not out of reverence, but reckoning. Jonathan Blake stepped forward, a file now in his hands. His tone was no longer cold, but final. This list contains the names of those who mocked, belittled, or humiliated my wife. You know who you are. You saw the footage. You heard yourselves. He looked out at the once confident crowd. The polished airs, corporate suits, high society wives. You didn't fail because you were greedy. You failed because you were cruel. He handed the folder to Grayson, who stood again, reading names one by one. Nathan Blake. The man who'd laughed first now stood pale and rigid. Charlotte Blake, Lexi Carter, Gerald Whitman, Elise Monroe, Marissa Avery. With each name, the weight grew heavier. Some whispered denials, others shook their heads, but none protested loudly. The evidence had already spoken louder than they ever could. Security staff, previously unnoticed at the edges of the room, stepped forward calmly, not to arrest, but to escort. You'll receive nothing, Jonathan said. No money, no shares, no access to my businesses. You'll be removed from all accounts, boards, and trust lines. This is not revenge. This is consequence. As Lexi stumbled toward the door, she looked back one last time. You ruined me, she spat, trembling. Jonathan didn't blink. You did that yourself. The doors closed behind her with a quiet finality. Then, something changed in the room. The tension eased. The air felt lighter, like a storm had passed. Jonathan turned toward the handful of people still seated, those who had said nothing, who had done nothing cruel. One of them, Sarah Ellis, an elderly woman in a modest gray shawl, blinked through tears. She had once been a nurse in a small-town clinic where Jonathan had received treatment years ago. She recognized Grace the moment she entered the room but said nothing, out of respect. She had simply offered Grace a tissue and a warm nod when she first arrived. Jonathan smiled at her. You didn't mock, you didn't question, you just offered kindness. He gestured for her to come forward. You will be honored in our will, not because of what you did for me, but because of how you saw Grace. Then he turned to Michael Reed, the soft-spoken librarian who had witnessed their wedding and quietly acknowledged Grace with a kind glance earlier. And you, Michael, You kept our secret. You respected our privacy. You showed more loyalty than half the people in this room combined. And finally, Jonathan walked toward a young woman in a plain black dress, Anna. A junior housekeeper. She'd been the only one to whisper, "You look lovely, ma'am," to Grace when she arrived. You saw a woman, not a threat, not a scandal, just a woman. He turned to Grayson. Their names are to be added to the inheritance. As equal benefactors. The room gasped, not in anger this time, but in awe. As the news settled in, Grace stepped forward. Her voice, as always, was gentle. "I didn't want to see people fall," she said. "I just wanted to see who would rise." She looked around, her eyes kind, but unwavering. "You were all given a chance today. Not to prove your wealth, but your worth." Then she turned to her husband. "And now, we begin again, with people who remember what it means to be human." The remaining guests rose, not out of habit, but out of genuine respect. Applause broke, quiet at first, then steady, not for drama, not for fortune, but for decency, as the sun poured through the tall windows of the Blake estate. Grace and Jonathan walked together toward the front of the room, side by side, not above anyone, just beyond what they used to be. And as the doors closed behind them, they didn't take just money or legacy. They carried with them something more powerful: truth, dignity, and the reminder that kindness is never wasted. In a world that often prizes wealth, appearance, and status, the story of Grace Bennett and Jonathan Blake reminds us of something far more enduring. Character is the true measure of a person. Grace walked into a room full of heirs and high society, dressed simply, speaking little, and yet standing taller than anyone through her quiet dignity. She was mocked, judged, and written off, but when the truth came to light, that she was Jonathan's wife and the sole heir, it wasn't money that silenced the room. It was her grace. This story isn't just about inheritance. It's about how we treat people when we think no one is watching. It reminds us that decency, kindness, and humility never go out of style, no matter how modern the world becomes. Many of us, especially those who've lived through decades of change, know what it's like to be overlooked or underestimated, but we also know the quiet power of patience and the lasting impact of choosing to treat people with respect. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a time you were misjudged, or perhaps a time you offered kindness to someone others ignored, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, full of meaning and heart, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with someone you care about. Because sometimes, all it takes is one story to remind us. The richest legacy we can leave is how we make others feel.